Hi students, in this video I'm going to talk about the Vietnam War, which comes to dominate the 60s and in particular the cultural context of the 1960s and the changes that had taken place in American society during the 1960s. Now last week I explained how in the United States you have, or at least in United States foreign policy, you have this position that the United States will support South Vietnam after the division of Vietnam into North and South at the end of World War II and with the driving out of French colonial power from Southeast Asia. French colonists are driven out. Vietnam is divided into two. The northern half is dominated by Ho Chi Minh, communism, and the southern half is supported by the United States out of fear that if the southern half were to fall to communism, that then the rest of Southeast Asia would also become communist and you would continue to see the spread of communism. And so the United States provides support for South Vietnam led by a president named Diem. And we see Eisenhower providing about $1 billion worth of aid. It's amazing how much American involvement in the world has just exploded since World War II. And this gives you a sense. A president who espoused pretty moderate foreign policy is spending this amount of money in a place where no actual war has broken out yet, although there are communist terrorist attacks against South Vietnam. Kennedy, remember, comes into office partly on the back of rhetoric that he would defend American interests more aggressively around the world. And so he increases the military and financial aid that Vietnam is receiving from the United States, including advisors. And this was slightly a rhetorical trick to imply that the United States didn't have any troops that were fighting on the ground. But these were military advisors who were supporting and leading and training the South Vietnamese army. Eventually, however, Kennedy becomes convinced that Diem has to be removed. He's seen as authoritarian, he has bad relations with the Buddhist majority religion in the region, and so Kennedy organizes for a coup to take this guy who had been an American ally up to that point, to take him out. And Diem and his brother are executed. Diem may not have been perfect, but he seems to have been the leader who was most likely to keep South Vietnam united. After him, and especially now that the United States has established the principle of removing South Vietnamese leaders that they don't like, the leaders of South Vietnam are generally military leaders who are seen as puppets of the United States and who are weak or ineffective or corrupt leaders. And so North Vietnamese pressure on South Vietnam continues and increases. And American involvement in the region also increases as we enter the Johnson presidency. And this leads to the incident in Tonkin Gulf in 1964, presented to the American people as North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacking American ships. And this is seen as an act of war, and the Congress gives Johnson the authority to take whatever action is necessary to defend American interests and American people in Vietnam. And so this is a huge mandate for Johnson to basically carry out war. What we now know happened was that American ships were working with South Vietnamese ships against North Vietnamese ships. So there was still fire exchange, but it wasn't the case that North Vietnamese ships came out and attacked American ships unprovoked. Nevertheless, now Johnson has this power, and at the same time, the Viet Cong, the guerrilla arm of North Vietnam that's operating and carrying out these terrorist attacks in South Vietnam, starts to attack bases that are staffed by US troops and US military advisors. Americans are losing their lives, are being wounded, and so Johnson institutes a bombing campaign designed to basically pound Vietnam into surrender. And then this is supplemented by a rise in troops and efforts to go out and basically find and destroy cells of the Viet Cong within South Vietnam. And in fact, this is not effective. This is a type of war that the United States military has not been trained or designed to carry out. The bombing of North Vietnam is largely ineffective because the North Vietnamese remain committed to their cause. It only works if they lose the will to resist. And at the same time, it is very bad for public relations because it makes the United States look like an impressive imperial power. At the same time, troops on the ground are getting attacked. They're unable to distinguish who are the communist sympathizers in Vietnam, who are those who are loyal to the South Vietnamese regime, and who are American allies. You have lots of confusion. You have Americans being killed. A lot of this material is being broadcast back to the United States into people's living rooms through television for the first time. People are increasingly horrified by what they're seeing taking place in Vietnam, especially in 1968 with the Tet Offensive, a series of surprise attacks launched against American military bases. And these attacks initially surprised the Americans and caught them off guard, but then when they recovered, they threw the North Vietnamese forces back with great losses. So in the end, this was an important military victory for the United States. It was, however, a catastrophic political defeat. The government had been saying for some months, don't worry, although you're seeing casualty numbers rising, America is winning this war. And then people see, again, broadcast over the television, that American troops are dying, Americans are having to pull back from some of their advanced bases in the early days of the Tet Offensive. And this basically establishes that the political will for the United States to win the war, it's not going to be there anymore. And after Johnson's presidency, we see the new president, President Nixon, is going to start to pull American troops out of Vietnam. Of course, the slow pullout of troops from the region is devastating for American military morale. And we start to see troops who are overdosing on drugs, troops who are being insubordinate, troops who are carrying out war crimes in frustration and anger against the Vietnamese. And this is, and basically, the Americans know that they're leaving. They know they're not going to be able to achieve what they set out to achieve. And so we start to see that frustration, that disengagement. No one wants to be the last one to die in a war that's basically over. In the end, in 1973, the North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, and the United States agreed to the Paris Peace Accords. And in the Paris Peace Accords, the United States promises to aid South Vietnam if they're attacked again. And in exchange, the United States promises North Vietnam that they're going to stop the bombing campaign, they're going to move their troops out of Vietnam. In reality, this is a face-saving exercise between the United States and North Vietnam. The United States isn't technically admitting defeat, and the North Vietnamese basically get a free shot at South Vietnam. And that's what happens. 2 years later, South Vietnam collapses and is taken over and becomes part of the communist regime of Vietnam. And so this is an important war from a cultural standpoint in terms of trying to understand the history of the United States. It is the longest war that the United States has fought up until this point, and the most disappointing in its history in terms of its results. And so it very much reveals the limits of American authority, of American influence around the world. It presents the Americans as, or the American military at least, as less powerful than people had hoped, and it presents them in a less positive light than people hoped. You know, they are seen bombing civilians, attacking civilians, and of course the reality is a little different on the ground. But from a perception back at home, it's not a war that encourages pride in American society and in the United States as a country in the way that World War I and World War II and the Spanish-American War. Previous American generations had had wars in the past that had imbued them with a sense of patriotism, a sense of unity, and had helped bind the country together. The Vietnam War does the opposite of that. with consequences that we'll look at in the next video.